Well, the question is, can you paint in the rain? And the answer is not really, probably not a good idea. Of course, I think everybody knows that, but there's people that think if there's moisture on the wall at all that you can't paint. And the truth is most paints you can paint, water-based paints, that is oil-based, no moisture. Water-based paint, you can have up to 15% moisture. For instance, you could be painting underneath here when it's raining and it would still dry, and it would still work just fine. So sometimes after a rainstorm, the walls are really wet down on the bottom of the wall. So usually what I'll do is if we paint like the day after, sometimes I try and wait a couple of days just because usually there's wind issues like there is right now. There's wind, stuff like that right after a rainstorm. And some of you guys in states where like Florida and stuff like that, I mean, it's like you're jumping rain puddles all the time. So, you know, it's on stucco and stuff like that. When you're using flat paint, the flat paint does allow the wall to breathe. So the moisture usually can come out of it even if it's a little bit more wet even than the 15%. That's just a general rule for painting to follow, the 15% rule. But if you're using flat paint and it's on stucco, the water can usually find its way out. The whole thing you don't want to do is trap the water in. When you trap it in with an enamel, like a semi-gloss, when I say enamel, that means semi-gloss, doesn't mean oil base. I mean semi-gloss or something with a sheen. When the moisture is trapped in, that's when you have problems with it wanting to pop off and peel because it has no place to go. The moisture wants to work its way out. When the sun hits it, it gets hot, it kind of steams up inside there and wants to gas its way out, and it can't. So with flat paint, as long as it's not too wet, a lot of times it will actually release the moisture versus the enamel won't. Now, just for fun, have I ever painted in the rain? Absolutely, I have. And I think some of those guys in Florida probably get stuck right when all of a sudden it's clear. Then, man, those rainstorms just come up on you really quick. I was in Florida underneath the umbrella painting oil base. Yeah, you can do it. Just had to dry the surface off, and then used some heat that I had. I had some, like a heat gun, a cordless heat gun, heat up the surface and make sure the paint dried and heat up the paint after it was dry so I could put some vinyl lettering on it. I was up in the Bay Area in California and we had to do a night job and we didn't see that it was forecasted for rain, and right in the middle of the job it started just pouring rain. Yeah, that wasn't good. It was on a metal wall, and but really it still dried. Came back the next day, it looked fine. It looked fine until they tore the building down, which was about 5 or 10 years later. Yeah, I was painting some metal awnings one day and all of a sudden it just started raining. You know, same thing. It was just dry enough to where it wouldn't run off. That's, you got to get lucky there. If it's too wet, it'll start to run off and then it'll leave some staining on the ground. Typically, if that happens, you just get your power washer off. It'll come off pretty easy. The thing I'm always worried about is if it hits, you know, gets somebody's clothing or something like that when it's an entrance to a store. That's always a concern. I was doing another big store and it was same thing. It was night job and we were actually using enamel. We were using primer at that time and primed the walls, and then right when we were done priming, it just started raining. And you know, it was a metal wall again. That was another concern. No issues. Came back the next day, primer was dried. It had some streaks in it. It was pretty wet when we were putting it on. So, but was able to paint over it the next day, and no issues because it happened in the middle of the night. I mean, literally, we worked from 12 to 4. It was a big storefront, and there was no choice but to do it at night. It was a really busy place. So yeah, I certainly wouldn't recommend doing it, but there's just times when it's going to happen. And when it happened to me, I was a bit concerned. You know, you should be, because you never know what's going to happen. And, you know, you might have it streak down the wall, might land on somebody's clothes, might land on somebody's car. and there's really nothing you can do until it stops raining. So, but so far so good. I haven't had an issue with that. But yeah, you know, I've had jobs where they were a big overhang and they needed the wall done, so it was like, well, I'm going to paint around where the signs go, and they put the signs up while the wall's wet, and came back the next day. They dried out. Now the concern then is when the letters are up there, the water creeps along, hits the tops of the letters, and goes over the wall, and then can streak it down. But it didn't have any issues because the stucco was dry, and the paint was able to dry into the stucco. So things like that are things you need to look at. When it's over metal, it's always the worst concern ever. When it's on stucco, it's not as big a deal. Yeah, the people who are in Washington, Florida, maybe even Georgia, South Carolina, those areas where it just is raining a lot, they're going to tell you more about this than me. But I had my share of it. I've done it in the rain. So if I was doing this building right after a rainstorm, I would just paint the eaves because I know they're dry, right? As long as there's no moisture in them. Stay away from the fascia, let that dry out for a day. And then I would just come down the walls to where you can see the splashes. This is faded, needs to be painted right now. So the flashes, you know, where the splash is hitting the wall, that's about where I would stop right in there, and then I would just do that later in the day, let it dry a little more, and then do that portion as it dries. And I've never had one peel ever from doing that. So anyway, if your customers like freaked out about you painting right after a rainstorm, maybe they just never lived where there was rain like that, and they may not even know, but they could watch this, and I've done it hundreds of times when it's like that. And again, never ever ever had a problem with peeling, especially as long as it's not enamel. If it's flat, it'll breathe its way out. And again, make your comments, you guys in Florida, you guys in Georgia, or you guys in the South, you guys in Washington where it's raining like almost every day, when you're lucky to get, you know, no rain for a couple hours. Make your comments so there's people that are freaked out about that, because I get a lot of times people get all freaked out when I talk to a customer and they're like, oh no, you can't paint today, it's wet, you know. It's like, no dude, what do you think they do in Washington? What do you think they do in Florida? They just work with it. They make it work. You got to do it. So anyway, make your comments down there. It'd be good for those people who are freaked out and looking at this video, and it might help them realize that they're just freaked out about nothing. All right, I'll talk to you in the next video. Please like, share, and subscribe. I just want to say I'm not in the least bit condoning doing this. It's just if it happens, what I've done, and if you're going to do it at your own risk. Of course, I'll talk to you in the next one.